now for our next panel, we have the impact of AI regulations and ethics on manufacturing. And this is our final session in the Defining the Human Relationship theme of the day. So please welcome to the stage Dean Bartles, the President and CEO at Manufacturing Technology Deployment Group and a member of MLC's Board of Governors. Ron Castro, the Vice President of Supply Chain at IBM and the Vice Chair of MLC's Board of Governors, and Frank Journaud, the Senior Director of Technology Policy at the National Association of Manufacturers. And we'll welcome back Penny Brown, MLC's Senior Content Director.
All right, everyone. Well, I definitely hope that you enjoyed lunch, and I hope that we are not about to give you indigestion with what we are about to talk about with regulations and ethics. So we've heard some different sessions sort of touching on this throughout the day, starting with Dr. Bennett's keynote, where he mentioned some of the things around legislation with that, and you can sort of see the intersection between ethics and legislation, depending on what your particular, I guess, opinions are on that. So I'm glad to have some different experts from different sectors of the industry here to talk about what this might mean, especially in light of the presidential transition that's coming up in January. So with that, we're going to start with Frank. So a little over a year ago, the White House put out an executive order around AI usage, which so far has been about the closest thing we've had in the US to any sort of like federal AI law of any kind. But in light of that coming presidential transition, can you talk about what's going to happen with that executive order and what the landscape might be for any future sweeping federal AI regulations?
Sure, I'm happy to. Hi, everyone. So first, what did this executive order do? It did a few things. It didn't do, well, it did a lot of things, but not a lot of impactful things. And that's because the executive order was signed by the president without legislation. So he didn't have the authority of legislation to do a lot of impactful things. But he did, the executive order did a few things. First area of focus was AI safety and security. So developers of powerful AI systems were required to report test results to the federal government. The EU also directed NIST, which is a federal agency, to develop tools and standards to ensure that AI systems are safe and secure before they're publicly released. Another area they focused on was privacy. So it required, it didn't require, it encouraged the use of privacy-preserving technologies. I don't know if you're familiar with them, things like differential privacy and federated learning. And another sort of big area of focus was equity and civil rights. It directed federal agencies and federal contractors to ensure that when they use AI, they do it in a manner that doesn't exacerbate discrimination and bias. But as I said, because there wasn't legislation behind it, it didn't have a lot of requirements. It was requirements for federal agencies, for federal contractors, but not for companies out there in the commercial sector. So it wasn't inconsequential, but you said it's like the closest thing we had to federal privacy legislation. It was the closest thing, but it wasn't actually close to that. And so now, as you might be aware, President-elect has been President Trump has been reelected to a second term. And he's made it very clear that he was going to rescind that Biden executive order on AI on day one. He's going to have a very busy day one when he's back in office. So even though the EO wasn't very regulatory, it's going to be sort of rescinded. And the President-elect Trump has made it clear that his approach would not be regulatory at all. So that's from the executive branch. Turn to Congress. By and large, we at DNM have been heartened by the fact that Congress's approach to AI has been kind of cautious, has not been the kind of fairly heavy-handed regulatory approach that we've seen, for example, in Europe. The European Union had adopted an AI Act that was pretty heavy-handed. So, when you look at Congress, you see that both Republicans and Democrats recognize that, some may have concerns about some aspects of AI. In the long run, it's a deeply transformative set of technologies that's going to make our companies, our workers more innovative, more efficient, et cetera. So that's why they don't want to mess with a good thing. And again, regardless of sort of the concerns that some of members of Congress may have with AI, there's one thing that they know, both Republicans and Democrats, is they don't want China in particular to get ahead of us. And so they're really keen on sort of, having this sort of laissez-faire approach that I think in industry generally we're favoring. And I think that we're going to continue that's the approach of Congress so far, and I think we're going to continue to see that in the future.
So let's switch a little bit to the business side and the ethics in particular. So Dean, I'm going to direct this one to you. Businesses are definitely facing a lot of pressure to ensure that they're using ethical AI models in their operations. So how can manufacturers ensure things like fairness and accountability and transparency in their use of AI?
Yeah, so in the spirit of fairness, accountability, and especially transparency, I have to confess, I was really puzzled why I got asked to be on this panel with these two experts, because I don't know anything about AI, really. I figure it must be eye candy. Must be the reason they asked me.
I thought I was.
So what do all of you do when you're asked to ask questions that you've never really had the knowledge or expertise to answer? You turn to ChatGPT or you phone a friend. So that's exactly what I did, Penny. So I made a few notes. Bear with me, but fairness, accountability. Is my mic not working for you? Okay, is this better? I don't think that's on. Hello?
Yes.
Is it on? Okay. So under fairness, they talk about bias mitigation. Some of the CIOs that I've talked to refer to this as bias mitigation, and they say, listen, you really need to conduct some regular audits of the training data, because training data can contain some bias, right? It can maybe favor one population over another population. So conduct those regular audits and also ensure that the data does represent diverse populations. So when it comes to the people in your companies, that's really what this is talking about. It's harder to think about this in terms of the data coming off your machine tools being biased. But believe it or not, there are some examples of that in the literature as well. For accountability, they talk about establishing clear structures, clear accountability structures, and create an AI ethics board or committee, right, to oversee what you're doing. And for transparency, that's the most important one, providing clear, user-friendly explanations for how the AI systems make decisions. I know in my company, the employees are a little bit apprehensive about this whole AI adoption thing, and we've got to articulate to them how this AI is working and what it's going to actually do to help them. Clearly disclose the usage to the customers and the partners. John Dyke was up here earlier. His institute, SESME, is one of 17 existing institutes that are focused on advanced manufacturing technology. And there's a lot of companies involved in these institutes, and there's a lot of partnerships. So make sure that all your customers and your partners know what the risks and limitations are and how it's going to help them. And lastly, enable external audits or third-party reviews of what you're doing. So bring in those experts and make sure that your employees clearly understand how this is impacting them, and it's not going to take their jobs away.
So Ron, IBM obviously very active within the AI space, and as Dean was saying, trust is a huge piece of this. So, when it comes to verifying that AI models are trustworthy, data governance is really essential to that. So how can manufacturers establish that type of data governance within their operations?
Excellent, and I did think I was the eye candy here. Anyway.
You are wrong.
All right. No, so I've been coming at it from a data practitioner in supply chain. I've been many years now involved in doing AI, and trustworthy and being able to have reliable outputs is key for any AI model. When we think about the amount of data, I mean, there's all kinds of statistics, but based on the Institute of Business Value, like 90% of the data has been created the last couple of years. So it's just an exponential amount of data. And data is data, right? But unless you have the AI models to translate that data into insight, optimization, action, it's just data, right? And how do you make it actionable? And one of our key pillars in IBM is we think about the AI models being accountable for the inputs, the outputs, traceable and explainable. And when you peel the onion, this a big pillar of this, a big chunk of this comes to the data and the data governance, right? So a few elements to consider from a data governance policies, right? It's how you're collecting the data, how you are storing the data, how you're sharing the data. And then in the context of this discussion, I mean, a lot of regulations, right? So keeping up and making sure your GDPR, CCPA, some of the ISO, et cetera, it's a very dynamic space. Managing the data, the privacy of the data, who has access to the data, security, and then how that data is being used, right? So you got those policies, but then you need quality and integrity in the data. So how are you standardizing the data? How do you eliminate bias? Some of the things you were mentioning as well. Validating the sources of where the data is coming from. And then you get hostile data in the AI model, you're going to get hostile responses out, right? So how do you filter the data for hostility, many things, poison data, et cetera. And a little bit back to your point on roles and responsibilities as well, and having that accountability in the organization, right? Some of the things we've done in IBM, we have a chief data officer that helps govern the overall data policy structure, but also in the different domains, we have data stewards, right? So when you're working, for example, in the supply chain domain or the manufacturing domain, an advocate for the data stewards, and having that clear accountability and compliance, right? And one of the key things when we talk about traceability, explainability of the model is documentation. It's documenting where the data is coming from. Where is it being stored? How is it being transformed? But actually documenting all those processes so there's traceability and understanding of exactly what's going on with the data and documented records around it. And then, so you got all these policies, you got the quality data, you know how to manage it, you need to secure it in a safe, secure environment that's scalable, right? So think about things like, obviously encryption, blockchain, being able to scale up, managing access to the data, so making sure that the right folks can only access the information that they need, so role-based type of access, all kinds of security concerns here, and making sure your data stays clean and doesn't change. And then you mentioned on this, right, but audits. I mean, things are changing. The ideal is to design data, cleanliness, data focus from the design phase, but this is changing. It's dynamic. Regulations are changing. You need to, the AI, GenAI models are learning. They're changing as well. So you need to make sure and validate the audit of the results. And are there any biases? Are the results accurate, quality, et cetera? Which brings me to the last point, which is the stakeholders and the empowerment, right? You need a closed loop system as well, relative to being able to get and receive feedback out of the AI models. So I think that's a little bit of the key points I wanted to make. It's when we think about AI, Gen AI models, I mean, the value, it's changing industries already. The adoption is growing up incredibly. We need to have the trust of the users and the outputs really augment the humans to make better decisions, and the garbage in, garbage out. So having clean data at scale, it's critical here.
So you just mentioned audits more from like an internal perspective, but that dovetails perfectly into my next question for Frank, which, again, from sort of a federal agency perspective, right now your business finances are audited by the IRS, or your factory is subject to inspection, say, by the FDA or some other sort of regulating agency. Do you think that manufacturers are someday, or maybe even business in general, is going to find their AI algorithms subject to an audit from some sort of federal agency? And what do you think that might look like?
So the problem with the future is it's hard to predict. So I'll make predictions, and please don't hold me to them too tight, because both in Congress and in federal agencies, I think there is a healthy dose of modesty about sort of the fact that, these are rapidly evolving technologies. I mean, a lot of folks were barely talking about them in the government world until about 3 years ago, until, ChatGPT burst out onto the scene. The use cases are still evolving. And so, there's a recognition that, and as I said earlier, that you don't want to mess with a good thing So there's a relatively cautious approach to that. Another thing that I would say is a lot of the concerns, I think it's healthy that a lot of regulators are not assuming that, oh, new technology means it creates new problems and therefore I need new laws or new regulations. That in fact, the concerns that are raised by AI may already be sort of addressed in existing laws and regulations. And fraud is fraud, discrimination is discrimination, whether you perpetrate that through, it's a human or whether it's an automated system with a human sort of written algorithm, or whether it's an AI algorithm that does that, at the end of the day, the problem sort of remains the same. So what, for example, and it's not often that you hear someone like me who works for an industry group praise the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. But I will, in this instance, about a year and a half ago maybe, they put out a statement that said, because there are laws, as you may be aware, that require, that forbid discrimination in employment. And they said, yeah, that's already on the books. Whether you do that, whether it's a human or an AI algorithm that does that, it remains the same. And so they put out guidance that said, steady as you go, business as usual. We will, fight discrimination. We will crack down on discrimination however you perpetrate it. And they did not feel that they needed more sort of specific regulatory authority or regulatory requirements to do that. So generally, I think, we are not seeing a lot of sort of very in the weeds requirements about how AI models or AI systems should be audited, what kind of essentially sort of paper trail, what kind of compliance with best practices you need to put forward. That may come in the future, maybe when sort of that field is is a little more settled. But for now, it's a fairly sort of cautious approach that I think we're seeing and that we're going to continue to see.
Yeah, and I know that, I can't remember which agency it was now, kind of came out and basically said, at the end of the day, a business is still responsible for how it's deploying AI. You can't just say well, we didn't know what was going on. We let the algorithm do it. It wasn't us. So we'll see if that's kind of the position that continues. So Dean, let's talk a little bit about bias for a minute here. How do you think manufacturers can identify bias in AI, and what can they do to maybe prevent that in the first place?
Sure. So again, I did a thorough review and talked to several friends, and here's what we come up with. So number one, again, audit the data being used. Look for imbalances, such as overrepresentation or underrepresentation of certain groups. Another thing was, this is a plug from my friend here from IBM, use bias detection tools like IBM AI Fairness 360.
Nice.
I've heard that before, but apparently that's one of the many tools. And if you Google AI Fairness tools, you'll come up with that one as well as several other ones. Evaluate model predictions for systematic disparities and collect feedback from users, especially those from diverse backgrounds, to identify unintended consequences. And that's what happens often with the deployment of AI, is you get these unintended consequences. And so it's good to talk to different people from different groups to find out if any of that's happening.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
Just to be clear, it's not because my message is generally sort of at the federal level at least. It's different at the state level. I think we're going to talk about that in a minute. But at the federal level, you don't have too much to worry about. And my message isn't, and as a result, you don't need to listen to these guys. In fact, it's the opposite. It's as long as you sort of listen to sort of what these guys are saying about sort of your business needs to do the right thing. You need to sort of be on top of your data, be on top of your algorithms, work with your vendors to make sure that you sort of have a governance, a posture in place, that you're tracking things, that you have processes, that you're holding yourself accountable. As long as you do that, you're basically keeping the likes of me at bay. The federal regulatory threat, isn't here yet, but it's not like policymakers at the federal level do not have concerns about those issues. As long as you're doing the right thing, which makes sense for your business, it makes sense for your customers and consumers, you also sort of are sort of keeping those concerns of policymakers low and therefore make it less likely that they'll step in and say, all right, well, you're messing it up, so I'm going to have to tell you how to do it.
Very good. And I'll add a little bit, but my intention here is not to make an IBM blog, right? But as you were mentioning, there's many tools, and other companies have tools as well. But we've been very focused on kind of a platform-centric approach. So hopefully you've heard about Watson X, right, which is our AI platform. But inside that scheme as well, there's very much a lot of tools, automation that can be applied on Watson X data, which is all about how you manage the data, automation, check for biases, all these things, and Watson.gov that really focus on the governance of GenAI foundational AI models.
So since this is the segment of the programming on defining the human relationship, let's talk a little bit, Ron, about worker empowerment, basically. So, keeping humans front and center, of course, is essential for basically any sort of technology deployment, but especially AI. So that could include a C-suite leader talking about ethical technology, but also, workers basically at every level feeling that they're empowered to speak up if they see something that might be concerning. So how can, workers or companies really ensure that their workers are given that type of empowerment?
Yeah, excellent question. I'm sure there's many different angles you can go at this one, but I'll share a little bit of my experience and what we have inside IBM and specifically in my organization as well. Some of this applies to everything, not just AI and technology, but I'll give a few examples of how we're applying those as well. So first of all, I think it all starts from the top. And when I mean the top, it's even the board of directors, making sure you have the right industry expertise, geographical coverage, et cetera, but they drive a governance around integrity as well. And then as you go down to the CEO and the SCLTs as well, is this focus on creating a culture of openness and collaboration. And you could peel on the onion, right, creating this culture of integrity all the way down to the employees. And back on integrity, and I think maybe you mentioned this. In IBM, we also have an ethics committee as well that helps govern and get actually feedback from the employees. But as part of that, every year, we basically train every single employee on the IBM values around integrity, ethics, et cetera. And not only from a kind of an academic perspective, but also real-life examples of ethical dilemmas and how to handle them, those kind of things. So every year we go through that level. Then for employees to really be empowered, the next level is skills and education. And making sure folks are getting skilled on the new technologies, where things are heading, depending on the level, of course, it's different kind of education. But some of the things we do inside our supply chain is something called like a data citizen. So what we do is we take different SMEs from different domains inside our supply chain and train them on as a data citizen. And what they do is they then take specific examples, challenges, problems in their specific area and apply those learnings and then get some innovation in that space. We also have been running for the last few years 3 full days around the digital supply chain, and it's mostly focused around AI. And what we do is we bring subject matter experts, we meet serious leaders, we bring distinguished engineers, fellows, we then bring academicians, right? And we have 3 days that is just focused on that. We do it live, but then also we record all the sessions so folks can go back. So they're only not getting, they can get deep expertise on some areas, but they can also get like a broader, simplified view of very complex issues, right? So it's breadth and depth. So those are a couple of examples. A big focus on communication, right? And making sure that the message is disseminated. And back to your point on feedback, right? And this is a softer element, but it's creating that culture that there's no retaliation for feedback, right? And being able to get that. Along those lines, we've deployed AI champions. So we've got AI champions at the most senior levels, but then AI advocates, back to my point, in different domains, right? So they're disseminating the information down as well and educating, but also they're gathering feedback up. And the one that I'm very passionate about is just engagement. And it's just making sure that the folks are engaged. And what I mean by that in the context of AI, for example, is design workshops, making sure that as we're working on GenAI foundational models, we're getting their input from bottoms up of where are the pain points, where are the workflows that would help, what would augment their capabilities for decision making, et cetera. And probably one last example I'll give of something we did that was very helpful, and this was an IBM level initiative. We call it the Watson X Challenge. So we basically freed up the whole population to go and form small teams and leverage the IBM Watson platform to come up with different use cases for AI. That was extremely helpful because not only it sparked a lot of innovation across the company, things that were seeds, but also by using different AI models, folks were able to provide feedback on where the gaps are, what needs to be improved, risk of biases, ethics, whatever, and then be able to transform that into better products for our clients. So it was truly a bottoms up as well as tops down initiative. And the last one I'll finish on is and it's very related to the engagement, is the employee accountability. And back to the point we were talking before, I mean, who owns the output, right? Who owns the execution? At the end of the day, AI is going to enhance, it's going to augment our human capabilities, but the decision makers are still humans and that accountability. So having that accountability is key to drive the empowerment we're discussing. So it's, I mean, we've talked about a few elements, but really having the human element, the empowerment, engagement, it's really helped us create trustworthy AI models that people are comfortable with, they're going to be leveraged, and we're going to get this huge value of the data via AI.
So this is switching gears quite a bit, but Frank, you just mentioned the sort of state landscape that we have. So, there's sort of this patchwork of state regulations coming out. So new Congress and new presidential administration doesn't sound like they're particularly aggressive on any sort of legislation or regulations. But what do you think is going to be happening at the state level?
I mean, it has been and it will continue to be quite different from the very cautious approach that we've seen at the federal level. At the state, I don't mean to say that the states are, rushing ahead with crazy, heavy-handed legislation the way that the EU has with the EU AI Act, but it's certainly kind of like somewhere in between, it is a more regulatory approach. So we've seen states legislate on algorithmic bias and discrimination. So for example, California and Colorado have enacted laws to prevent that bias and discrimination. So what that does generally is it requires transparency in AI decision-making processes, mandates regular audits to ensure fairness. So that's one thing we've seen. In the HR context, automated employment decision tools. So New York City kind of blazed the trail there, but then at the state level, New York, not just city, but state, and Illinois have introduced regulations that govern the use of AI in hiring and employment. So generally, you have to notify candidates using AI. You have to ensure that your tools do not perpetuate bias. It can be those sort of the way you do that can be more or less sort of cumbersome. And then I'm thinking in particular of Utah in the field of consumer protection. Utah passed a law that was quite important. It does a few things. It requires businesses disclose to consumers that they're using generative AI systems rather than the consumer interacting with an actual human. It makes the company liable for its use of AI. So, if it violates consumer protection laws, you can't say that the robot did it. It's your responsibility. We've seen deepfake regulation, use of deepfakes, in particular in the non-consensual sexual imagery, or also in political campaigns. But what we're also seeing is, as I said, an approach where we don't want to mess with a good thing. So rather than states, rushing and imposing regulatory requirements, they're essentially sort of doing, blue ribbon commissions. Let's task forces to study the problem. What might be sort of appropriate policy responses, et cetera. So we are seeing an approach that is more forward-leaning, but not heavy-handed at the state level.
Well, gentlemen, that's going to do it on our time. You wrapped that up exactly as the countdown clock went to 0, but thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
You appreciate it.